Hello and welcome to another episode of the CG Garage. This is episode number 393 featuring Garman Herigstad, who is a major veteran in the visual effects industry. He has been in the trenches for a long time and has seen a lot of things. You know, it's kind of reminds me of like, if I could tell you all the things I've seen, you know, from Blade Runner when he talks about that, all the battles. So he is definitely an amazing person and a great, you know, when I first started in the industry, Garman's one of the people that I first met because it was the first movie I worked on. And so he sort of told me about the state of the industry. And that was, 20 years ago. And he was in it for even longer than that. So really amazing guy. Happy to talk to him. And this is a long podcast. Just give everyone warning. This is a long podcast, but it's totally worth it. So Kristen, what did you think of it?
Well, yeah, like you said, he's been in this industry forever. He's kind of done it all. And he's also lived it all. So he's lived and worked and taught in Iowa to Asia to LA and Vancouver. And he kind of started off with a degree concentrated in calligraphy and hand lettering. And then he got his master's of arts in drawing and painting, which then introduced him to the early computer graphics. And that's where he started at the computer animation at post-production in 1986. And then he's gone on since to production in VFX and like I said, taught in VFX so many different places. And now he's kind of gone back to his roots, doing more design, illustration, lettering, but just some of his works include like Castaway, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Beowulf, which he talks about. Like, I think he said he is Beowulf, and then, or it would be, and then Stealth, Ender's Game, just to name a few. But yeah, it's such an interesting story. Long podcast, so get a glass of wine or coffee to listen. It's really good. Yeah,
not quite as long as a Martini Giant podcast, but still, it's really great, great to have him on. And he's actually, he's been the mentor and a teacher for a lot of the other people who have actually been on this podcast. That's what he's done. So some of the people who have really succeeded in visual effects have been, students of his. So it's really kind of an important guy, and he's really paying it forward in a lot of ways because he learned from a lot of people, and now he's paying it forward by teaching people and mentoring people. So really awesome to have Garman on. So very cool. Okay, we've got a couple of announcements. So you can find all this out at chaos.com. But the first one I'm going to tell you guys about V-Ray 6 for Maya. It is out officially. It includes a lot of the cool stuff for V-Ray 6 for Macs, including V-Ray NMesh, finite dome lights mode, procedural clouds, but also has a lot of other cool stuff, such as the enhanced USD support. You can now do some profiling, so you can calculate all the memory consumption and all stuff. So it'll help you really debug your render in case you're having some slowdowns and figure out exactly what needs to be fixed in your render. And also, but speaking of optimization, it also has, we've optimized V-Ray fog rendering, which is about 30% faster, and our translucent materials are twice as fast. So lots of cool stuff in V-Ray 6 for Maya, and it is out. Go check it out at vray.com. I should also note, before you start asking about other products, V-Ray for SketchUp and V-Ray for Rhino are on public beta in terms of V-Ray 6. So go check those out on our website as well if you'd like to try out the betas. Okay, we've got a few announcements in September. Let's run through them real quick, Kristen.
Yeah, you can find these out at chaos.com/events. So the first one isn't technically a Chaos one, but you will be at THU starting today. And you'll be there through the week. So if you are there, find Chris, say hi. And then September 24th through 28th, Chaos will be at the Design Symposium Week in Berlin. September 26th through 30th, Chaos will be at 3D Base Camp in Vancouver. And then September 27th through 29th, Chaos will be at Autodesk University in New Orleans. So we'll be everywhere.
We'll be everywhere. Again, absolutely. And go check out all those dates in case you don't remember them. There are a lot of them in September, but you can check everything out at chaos.com/events. Again, that is chaos.com/events. Now, if people want to know more about the podcast, where can they go, Kristen?
You can go to facebook.com/CG Garage Podcast or chaos.com/CG Garage. And if you'd like to watch us, go to youtube.com/Chaos Group TV.
Perfect. And if you guys have any other ideas or want to hear more or any feedback about it, and you just want to drop us an email, the email is labs@chaos.com. Again, that is labs@chaos.com. Of course, don't forget to leave us a review and a rating on Apple Podcasts. Share us with all your friends and family. But for now, Please enjoy episode number 393 with Garman Herigstad.
Welcome to another CG garage where the chaos group talks. You'll know it's over when the last bucket drops. We're gonna fire off rays in high dynamic range. We know that ambient occlusion is passe. Global illumination won't lead you astray. And while image-based lighting is really swell, you need to make sure everything has Fresnel.
Cool. How are you?
I'm good.
Living
in Iowa again after 30 years of roaming the earth. So
yeah. So that's an interesting. Iowa is an interesting place. Is that where the journey started?
yeah, pretty much. I mean, I lived in Minneapolis when I was little, and then Roland, Iowa is my dad's hometown. It's like the old Herigstad roost when they came over from Norway, and then I lived in Denmark a year. That's where my mom's from, and I used to speak Danish, and that's all gone.
Yeah.
And came here about, I don't know, 6 or 7. My dad worked up in Minneapolis for a while, and then he wanted to come back to his hometown, and then I went to Iowa State, just a few miles down the road, and studied graphic design. And
what got you into graphic design? Why did you want to do that?
Yeah, it was great. So back then it was called advertising design. So I had to take. I mean, it was really great at the time. I think we had to take graphic design classes, and we had to take drawing classes, 3 or 4 drawing classes, and then painting classes, like 4 painting classes, and as well as a design class. And plus we had to take advertising and marketing classes. And when I just joined when I switched from music, I was a music major, and I switched from music to advertising design, and the art department had been under home economics, so like I would have to take it like sewing 101 or something like that. I mean, they had a decent like fashion design program, so I have to say that wouldn't have been a bad thing to have in your back pocket. But so a new design college was forming, and so all the college credits for the other college became electives. So I had 45 electives. So some of my music credits that I had for my first year went into that. But then I could fill it with pretty much anything I wanted. And I one of the first classes I could get into was a calligraphy class, which led to the whole 3D thing. So when I switched over from music, I didn't really know what commercial art was, but my dad did. My dad had worked for Motorola, and they had hired like, people to do logos and brochures and things like that. And so my dad wasn't artistic at all. My mom was more, but my dad was, yeah, commercial art's great. It was wonderful. Fantastic. But I got into a calligraphy class, and my handwriting was terrible. My handwriting is still terrible. But I took to the calligraphy, and I had a really good teacher, Ron Fenimore, and he loved letters, and so he taught this class, and then I learned calligraphy, and then I learned other kinds of hand lettering, like how to like make something like reflective, and that was the day where the state of the art graphic technology was like an airbrush. So you like airbrush things that looked like they were metal or water or chrome or something like that. And so I was all into that. And so I wanted to be a lettering artist. And so when I was in school, I took the one calligraphy class, and then I ended up taking like 4 calligraphy classes essentially. And then and just did more lettering. And then back then, the great place to work was Hallmark if you were a lettering artist. And so I sent my portfolio off to Hallmark. They're in Kansas City, 4 hours down to I-35, and they rejected it. And I'd redo my portfolio, send it back. They'd reject it. I'd redo it again because I specifically wanted to work in their lettering department. They had a great lettering department. And the fourth time they interviewed me, and I thought, this is it. So I drove down there for an interview, got a tour of the building, had lunch with a couple of the artists. They were telling me what it's like to work at Hallmark, and then I didn't get an offer. And I was just like crushed. And then I applied to Gibson Greeting Cards, which was like the third greeting card company. There's a Hallmark, American Greetings, and Gibson Greeting Cards in Cincinnati. And they were like the less prestigious. And then when I went to work there, so they offered me a job, and I'm like, what else am I going to do? And the first week I got there, there's like a little older lady there who was like, who did like these beautiful like snow covered houses illustrations for Christmas cards. And she said, you need to get out of here as soon as possible. This company's going to ruin you. and at that time I got a master's degree. So after I got my undergrad degree, I got a job in a print shop in Des Moines, Iowa, at a place called Christian Printers, and they did mostly business forms. And it was kind of, like I would do paste up of like, milk order forms for the milkman, check 2% whole milk, whatever.
Right.
Horribly boring, but technically, and then I learned how to do a CompuSet typesetting. So I learned typesetting, photo typesetting, which is kind of like writing HTML, something like that.
Right.
And so
what year was this approximately?
So this was, I graduated in 81.
Okay.
With my BA. And then, then I went, so I got this job at this print shop, and I didn't know how to manage my time. And so like I begged my boss to, give me something cooler to do. And so he found a project for me, and I totally blew it. And because I didn't know how to manage my time, she said, oh, it's going to be due on Thursday. I'm like, no problem. And then Thursday came around, they're like, where's the project? I said, well, I have time on today, so I'm going to work on it today. And something else had happened, and the two things combined, the bosses kind of walked over to my desk once and said, we can't keep you anymore. And they didn't say it, but I'm sure I was like too expensive for them. And then,
Right.
wasting money. If you waste time on a project, you're wasting money. And then, that was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because after that, I still do it. I keep track on my phone. Everything I do, I keep track of my time. 24 hours a day. So like I'm sleeping or whatever. And just because if you want to be a manager, you want to supervise other people, if you don't know how long it's going to take you to do something, somebody else isn't going to know. You're not going to know how to judge somebody else. And then
Right.
when I hired people later, I would say, well, this person is like, maybe they're twice as fast as me at something, or they're half as fast as me, or it's going to take more time. So anyway, that getting fired was, like I went back later and thanked my boss for firing me.
Nice.
And then that sent me back to grad school, because right when I got fired, they said, well, we need a teaching assistant, for the fall. So I went back to Iowa State, and then I taught how to do the typesetting stuff, and it was also offset printing. And that was under the industrial education department. Then I ended up shifting back to the art department, and I got a master's degree in drawing and painting. And Iowa State's a science school, and so then I had to take a computer programming class, which I dreaded. Like when I was an undergrad, I would only go into the computer science building to stay warm on my way to the library. Like I ditched into the computer science building and walk a block to get out of the cold. And I didn't think I had anything to do with computers, but the images were fascinating. That's back when they would use like the keyboard characters to print out like giant images, that looked like an airplane landing or something.
Sure.
And so like far away, it looked like a picture, but you got up close to it, it was all these like, letters of the alphabet. And then I had to take a statistics class, which I also thought I would hate because I was not good at math. But both of the teachers were good teachers, and they made it interesting. And so I was like, wow, all the statistics stuff, I could visualize that. And back then I was visualizing it with like airbrush or, doing an illustration. And when I took the computer programming class, we had to write it was on a Commodore PET, pre 64, little ice
Okay.
cube or whatever, and and it had these graphic keys on it. So we're supposed to write like a checkbook balancing program, and I did that, but I wrote another program that made like pictures out of those graphics keys, and the teacher, bless his heart, um, looked at that and encouraged me to do something more with that. And then when I had to try to do my thesis, this teacher was like, he says, well, if you want to do something with computer graphics, you can continue to use the Commodore, which you have to program yourself, or you could use the school's mainframe program, but that's programming is like out of your league. And so you're going to
Right.
have to use a program that somebody else wrote. And then I showed my work. I was under the art department. I showed it to my major professor, this guy Richard Hagen, and he looked at this computer stuff that I did, and he's like, "Computer graphics is going to be big someday. I have no idea about any of it, but you should do that." And so I ended up writing my own graphics program on a Commodore 64, really crude. And it basically
Right.
just did Boolean math. So I would make these little symbols that would do Boolean math. And I bought the little keypad and moved the pictures around and stamped it. And that had that like cheesy, like 4-bit color or whatever, like 16 colors.
Right.
And I would take pictures of that, the screen, the TV screen, and then I would do these black and white printouts, which took like an hour to print out, like 8 by 10, that kind of thing. And then I made paintings based on those, and that was like my drawing and painting, what was computer programming. And then my professor and this number two from the art department, they were older, they were about ready to retire, and they were like, yeah, this is cool, this is all cool, it's something new, great. But it was the younger professors who were like, you can't mix computers and art. And so now that's like somebody would actually say that, but at that time the art community looked at computers and art as an evil, and I think they really thought like maybe computers were self-aware and had artificial intelligence back then. Yes, people didn't really understand what a computer did and what
Right.
the programmer did. And so, but anyway, the other faculty, they tried to get me kicked out of grad school for wanting to use a computer to do art.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I had to fight to stay in, and I almost gave up.
Were these
Um,
the students or the professors?
the professors,
The younger professors.
the younger professors, and my older
Interesting.
professor, he would like give me this update, and he would say, well, it's kind of a political war where professors fight each other and they use their grad students as their pawns or something like
Right.
that. And whether that's true or not. But anyway, going through it, 3 other grad students quit when they saw what I was going through. They're like, if Garman's going through this, forget it, I'm leaving. Um,
Right.
but I graduated, and I did these little computer printouts and then screenshots, and then I did these like big 4x6 airbrush paintings that were based on the computer stuff. So it wasn't like a one for one blow up, but it was like an inspiration. And I did stuff that I never would have done before. So it definitely influenced, my art making. So but when I graduated, the university like tried to keep it hush hush, and then I was still at the time trying to do the calligraphy thing, and I was still trying to get the job with Hallmark. And so at that same time, I was still doing the calligraphy thing and sending myself off to Hallmark, thinking that that's where I would go. And then Gibson Greeting Cards in Cincinnati hired me. I went there, and within the first month, I could tell that I'm not going to like this company, and there was too many disgruntled artists there, and then there was an art school in Cincinnati, which I think now is part of the Art Academy thing, but it was called the ACE College of Design, and they hired me to be a teacher to teach like a, a, 8-bit paint program that run on digital images PDP-11. I can't remember the name of the computer, but early big stuff, and then and uh, and so that was kind of like teaching graphic design by using computers, and because of my experience, so I could do that. It was basically kind of like a early version of what Photoshop would become, or Quantel Paintbox, paint with a stylus. And
Sure.
and in downtown Cincinnati, there was a company, Post Production Services, that had a Bosch FGS 4000. That was like the first, or one of the first, like turnkey systems where you could buy a 3D computer without having to program it yourself. And
Right.
that was in the era where Cranston Surrey was in Columbus, Ohio, and Omnibus and Robert Abel and Pacific Dan Images were the big guns. And so I took all the artwork that I tried to get my job at Hallmark. I did all this airbrush lettering, calligraphy, things that looked like ice, things that looked like. I took that down to post PPS, and then I had my computer programming background, or my quasi programming background. And they looked at that and said, "You're perfect." And so everything that I did to try to get one job ended up getting me a much better job. And so back then, the Bosch it was like $500,000 worth of equipment, because there's not only the computer, but then there's all this, like the videotape that we had to output to was $100,000 videotape recorder. And it couldn't do anything else. Like if you're outputting a tape, it would render a picture. And if that picture took 30 minutes to render, then the tape would rewind, click, and grab one frame. And so that's where I learned. And then PPS was great, as Bob Girding started this company, and they had a great engineer, Jim Bird, and who made sure that I learned all about video technology, like zero black, getting my color bars right, all that kind of video stuff. And then I had my first boss, Mark Stover, was, design was early back then. And so he was designing all this cool stuff for 3D. So we were doing TV commercials, corporate video, and some broadcast IDs, like for local TV stations, and then a lot of car commercials. And at that, I had married a girl from Hong Kong. We were both students at Iowa State. And so when I got offered the job at PPS, I knew that they were going to train me. And so I quit before I got hired, because I told my boss, I said, in 2 years, I'm going to go to Hong Kong. And so I know you're going to train me all this. And so I'm going to just let you know that I'll probably only be here for 2 years. And they hired me anyway. And then after the first year, I worked with this great animator, Peter Loft, who taught me all about motion and things. Like we'd walk to lunch, and he says, "Now look at how these cars stop." And he gave me an assignment. Okay, you got 3 cubes. One is a motorcycle, one's a bus, and one's a taxi. And they're going to go from one block to another. Animate them so they look like they're believable. And he gave me little assignments like that were really taught me how to look at things. And so that was just wonderful. So I was getting solid, video technology understanding. Because something's going to go on air, like back then when everybody had like tube televisions, and if you watch local TV, sometimes your television would start humming, and that's because they're playing a tape that has a wrong signal on it, and it makes
the reds are illegal, right?
What?
Or the reds are illegal. Remember the illegal reds?
Yeah. And so like everything you'd render would have to be like, the reds would have to be lower saturation on your screen, so that when it got on TV, it would look nice and bright. So, but then I ended up finding a job in Hong Kong, and it was almost like exactly 2 years to the day. First I went to Taiwan to work for a company, and for a few months, and then I went from Taiwan to Hong Kong, and I worked for a Wavefront distributor, and so they had the sales for Hong Kong and for mainland China. And that's back when everybody in China either wore like blue or green. and maybe there was like a few 4-story buildings in Beijing. And now it's just like unbelievable. And so so back then the talk was the China market. The China market's going to be this biggest market. And so all these American companies were like looking at China as like, we're going to sell all our American goods in China and make a fortune. But back
Right.
then, China had money for infrastructure. And so we sold like my first job in China I would fly out from Hong Kong to stay for a few weeks at a time, but was training the weather service how to uh, produce their daily weather graphics. And so it was the first time that Chinese television, like before they had like some PC 8-bit cheesy graphics show their weather, and there was no TV presenter. And so they were building a studio and they were training the news anchor or the news presenter how to walk in front of a green screen. And so,
Right.
it was kind of funny because I'm training these guys how to use Wavefront, and over in the corner, this girl is practicing walking in front of a green screen, and she's all giggles and stuff because it was new for somebody to see themselves on the screen in front of a
Right.
background. And that was an interesting experience. Like that Wavefront could read in scripts really easily. You could build a file, so it was really ideal for like if so the weather scientists. So I talked to these weather scientists. There was two ladies. Girl was about 26, and the other one was a woman about 50 years old. And these women were just like hungry to learn how to do this. And because their job was to take the weather data and translate that into a data that could be suitable for the graphics. So then I was
Right.
teaching them how to script in Houdini. So I made the basic template for, font and layout and all that kind of stuff. And then, Hangzhou and Shuzhou and all that. And then, had, how to make Chinese characters 3D. And that was an interesting experience helping the weather service. And then, uh, interesting. I know you had Blakey on a while
Yeah.
ago, and then um, on the Wavefront demo reel early one, there was this big cloud forming, and so the salesman in Hong Kong used this cloud forming thing to sell it to the Chinese weather service. But it was
Okay.
really a lie because they generated all the data. Wavefront basically visualized the data, but it didn't make the clouds move. And so there was like 110 situation when I was in Beijing talking to the head of the weather service for all of China, in those rooms where they, big Chinese conference room like Chairman Mao and Nixon sat in and had the spittoons between them. And I had to say, no, if you want the clouds to move like that, there's a lot more programming that has to happen. But if you want weather graphics, we're fine. We're set. And that's pretty much what they
Right.
use it for, automating the weather graphics. But and that was interesting. And so the company I was working for in Hong Kong, they were trying to sell Wavefront, but then they also said, well, let's start a production company to show people what Wavefront can do. And so I became the head of this production company. And the salesmen weren't really very good salesmen, but the production part just took off. And I had this pair of bosses, brothers and sisters. They were Singaporeans who lived in Indonesia. They got brought to Hong Kong to help start this company. And he introduced me to all the advertising people in Hong Kong. And I got me on television, interviewed on the morning show for, technology comes to Hong Kong, blah, blah, blah. And there was already a few companies in Hong Kong doing 3D, and it was like beginning to spread really fast. But our company was not affiliated with any video post-production company. So most of the places that had 3D had editing. So if you want to do 3D, you have to do your editing here. But our company, if we did 3D, we could do it at any of those companies. So I got to meet all these people. And you're talking about architecture. So back then, uh, the boss, the main investor of our company was building a house, and he wanted us to make a 3D model of it. And so I'm working on it, and then one day and so you had like we had a Jatico digitizing tablet and put the blueprints down and get all the points. And um, and so then one day, the one of the managers comes in and said, "Oh, this part of the building changed." And I'm like, I said, "It's really expensive to change this part of the building." And he said, "Don't worry about your expense because they've built the building and they're tearing the wall down of the real building." so, so that's more expensive than the change that you're making.
Right.
And so, but I thought, like, how are you going to make any money off of 3D building architecture? Because everything was so slow back then.
Right.
But little did I know. And then one of the advertising agencies that I'd visited, because I would go around with my demo reel and we'd do these projects to show what we could do. And an advertising agency had shown a client in Bangkok a video that Robert Abel and Associates had made of it was live action, but you would put these models down and they would do these camera control passes. And then they'd put in another model and do the pass again so you could dissolve from one to another. So it looked like these buildings were appearing, but they were just dissolving down because of these multiple passes of the camera.
Right.
All optical work. And they had sold this project to a big property developer in Thailand. It was basically building a city for 100,000 people based around factories. So they sold this idea, this videotape from Robert Abel to the client in Bangkok. And I think Robert Abel or or whoever it was, because Abel was about going out of business back then or right before then, but the company was going to charge them like $1 million for that. And so it was out of their budget. And so they came to me and I said, well, I can do something in 3D, but it's going to look different from live action.
Right.
And they said, so we talked about it and they said, well, you got 3.5 weeks. So I did a 60-second commercial in 3.5 weeks. And we had 3 computers, 3 SGI 4D50s, and
Right.
I had 2 other animators helping me, and it about killed us all. But
Yeah,
the
3
creative
weeks.
director was there sitting next to me the whole time. Like, if I had to make a decision, he was there ready to make the decision. And, the nice thing about the internet is I got in contact with this guy again recently. So he's a Singaporean, but lives in Hong Kong. And then, but so we finished that commercial, and it was the first time in Bangkok you'd ever see like a 60-second computer graphics TV commercial. And like and I got it hanging off my YouTube channel. And if somebody looks at it now, they're going to say that looks horrible. And by today's standard, it looks pretty bad. But by then, nobody had seen that before, so that it was a novelty look. Nobody had seen, and so and that commercial made me famous in Thailand. And then the it was a big property development. The first commercial was for the industrial buildings. So they were trying to get people to invest in these. The whole idea of the commercial was to get stock investment into this company so they could build these projects. Broadcast 20 times a night on prime time for 2 weeks. And so it completely saturated the market. And then that commercial was successful. And then we did 3 more. I did 2 more 60s and 145. And they gave us a little bit more than 3.5 weeks. And then when I would go in through immigration, they would ask me what I would do. And I would say, like, I did the Mong Tong Tiny commercials. And they were like, all of Thailand is proud of you. And so that was an interesting experience to have. So that was my introduction to working in Thailand. And then the company in Hong Kong ended up closing, even though we were busy, successful. And then I moved to Thailand because that's where most of the work was coming from. And I worked for myself for a while, renting equipment. And then I worked for Allura had as an Australian company. They had an
Yeah.
office in Thailand for a while, so I worked there for a while, and
Allura's been
then
around for a long time. I didn't realize how long.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that was 91, about
Right.
92, so 93, 94, something like that. And then there's a big television studio in Bangkok called Kantana, and so I went to work from Elora to Kantana and doing more commercial work. And then, but I was always gone from my daughter, and it just because they were in Hong Kong, and then my work was never really stable, and plus I didn't really want my daughter growing up in Bangkok, and so then we all moved to Singapore, and I set up shop in Singapore, and while I was in Singapore, I met Peter Bomar,
Hmm.
and then and Sean Chapman. I knew him from Hong Kong, but Canadian animator, and they were telling me that oh, you need to use Prisms. Prisms works just the way you work in Houdini or in Wavefront. You because you do all the scripting in Wavefront, you should use Houdini or Prisms.
But
And
prisms at the
then
time.
and
Yeah.
then Greg Hermanovic came to Bangkok or to Singapore and gave me a one-to-one demo. And right after the demo, I was like, where do I sign the check for $24,000? Who do I make it out to? Because I knew if
Right.
I started using Prisms, I could do work that my competitors couldn't do.
Right.
And and then by the time I was ready to get, I had like a demo version of Prisms on my, I had a SGI Indie, and the so when it was ready to, or when my sale purchase was finally come through, Houdini 1.0 came out, and so Greg said, don't get Prisms, get Houdini. And so all the
Okay.
Prisms users like hated the first version of Houdini because it
But
didn't
you'd
have
never
all the
used prisms that much, right? But
no. And for me,
right.
like it was like I'm in heaven. This can do all this
Hmm.
stuff. Um,
Right.
and then Peter Bomer, he taught at a school that was just like a mile away from where I lived. And so I would go down to see him, and he would show me some stuff. And the sales office in Singapore is a Singapore office. They had a really good tech guy that helped me get through questions and answers. And then that was 96, 97, right when email was starting. And so Side Effects had a email list server, and I'm using email. And so the first question I ever asked that I got an answer for a technical question was from Jason Iverson, and Jason was
Really?
in South Africa, and so I was using Wavefront and Advanced Visualizer and Houdini together. So I had to do a job with a flame on it. So I was going to do the fire in Houdini, and the other rendering I was going to do in Wavefront because I knew how to set up the lights and the render of that. And I was like, well, how do I get the cameras to communicate? So I put that question in, and Jason sent me an answer, blah, 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 you do this. And so I did that and got the cameras matching between Wavefront and Houdini. Seamless. And then just composite one over the other. And so then and then was the uh, when I was in Singapore, or right before I got to Singapore, um, Alias Research bought Wavefront. And then
Right.
Silicon Graphics bought Alias.
Yep.
And their first strategic decision they made was, we're going to discontinue Wavefront. And Wavefront before that had bought TDI, Thomson Digital. And
Right.
TDI had this great modeling package that kind of looked like Nuke before the interface, it's just a big
Mhm.
empty screen with buttons and stuff on it. And a fantastic modeling program. And then they just like killed it all. And I was just kind of pissed pissed about it,
Yeah.
so you're killing it. And so I was kind of, I had played with Power Animator, and Power Animator could render beautiful, but it was so slow, and I'm like, I got to have something that could render faster than that. And so that's when I got the Wavefront demo, or the Houdini, or the Prisms demo. And then so then I ended up going the Prisms route. But and then so finally, 2 years later, when Maya finally came out,
Yep.
I got the free upgrade, so I didn't have to pay support for a couple of years, and I ended up getting the free the first version of Maya. And so then I had both for a while, or I had all three. I had Wavefront, Maya, and Houdini, and then I ended up coming back to. I left Singapore in '97. I was going to work for Konami Games in Tokyo, and I had to wait 6 months to get a visa. And I thought, well, I'll put my daughter in school here in Roland, where I grew up, and then I'll when I get my visa, I'll go to Tokyo first, set up shop, and then when the school year's over, then and my daughter and my wife can join me. And right before I was supposed to go to Japan, waiting for my visa, there was a Asian economic crisis where it started in Thailand, but they tried to get the Thailand baht to be devalued, and they devalued the Thailand baht, and but then that caused a ripple of economic downfall kind of in all of Asia, and so then and Japan got suffered. I had my airplane ticket to go to Tokyo, and I got the most politely written letter I've ever received in my whole life was from Konami Games saying, "We're very sorry to inform you, but your job has been canceled." And my salary had been negotiated in U.S. dollars, and it went up like 30% or whatever. So I would have done very well in Tokyo if I would have got that job. Um,
Right.
but I had my airplane ticket. They didn't ask for it back, so I went over there and I looked around Tokyo for see if there's any other work to get, and I saw this chairman of this company, Yamashita Securities, on television in McDonald's, but he's like crying because his company like lost like 30 billion yen or something, and I'd be crying too. um,
Right.
and then I did like a tour of Bangkok and Singapore while I was on that trip, and Asia was like shut down economically. So I came back to Iowa, and a game company in Ames opened, started by engineering professors. At first, they were doing legal visualizations, but they started doing games, and they got the contract for a Bugs Life Active Play. So there were two games made for the Bugs Life 1 movie. One was like a interactive game, and then the one that I worked on was like playing. Look, kids would click on these little icons, and it would do these little pre-rendered, like GIF animation type things, sprite animation things. And so that's the scenes had to look realistic. So we got these images from Pixar of what the Bugs Life game was going to be looking like, and so there was a modeling department, but I got like my scene was the bug bar scene, and so I had to model the entire interior, and I had to rig my characters and then animate my characters. And so I had like one, two, three, four, like seven characters, a slug. I had to model a slug and make the background. And then I realized like the character animation. So they were using Maya 1.0 for the character rigging, and that the first Maya book was so well written. I think that's a big reason why Maya became successful. Is that book was just like solid. And
It was a lot of books. It was like just a
yeah,
huge
but
amount of books.
they made one, like getting started with Maya.
Oh, I
And
remember that one. Yeah.
if you went through that, then you would learn. And it was a really, and being a teacher, like I really appreciate well written learning materials. And so, uh, but I knew that, well, if I do character animation and I do effects, my brain's not big enough to do both. So I'm going to have to pick one or the other. And I kind of thought, there's probably going to be a lot of people that are going to want to do character animation, and I have to compete against all those people. And if I go to effects, there's probably less people who want to bother to learn how to do effects. And
Yeah.
so I split my brain, and then I tried to. I had been applying to work at Digital Domain even when I was still in Singapore, and Sony, and I'd go to SIGGRAPH, and I got rejected. And back then there was a stigma between television and film,
Yeah.
and you know that. So and um, and so like I was coming from TV, or worse, I had worked on a game, you know,
Right.
and so I did uh, and so I ended up getting a job at Digital Domain because of a funny car flipping at a drag race in Detroit. So David Burton, and he worked with Jeff Willett and John Willett at Traveling Pictures in Detroit. And
Okay.
Dave's dad built race cars and race funny cars, race
Okay.
cars. And then his car got in an accident, and the dad had to go to the hospital. And Dave had to animate this ant for a Rubbermaid commercial. And so they're looking for somebody to do this animation, and I'd worked on the Bugs Life character stuff, and I'm like, I can animate some bugs for you, um, and so I did that, and then Dave liked what I did, and so he would work for Didi, he would like work for Didi from Detroit, and so he referred me to Digital Domain, so that's how I got my first job there. I
Right.
see a flashing light behind me. Is that right?
Yeah,
Oh,
it was. It stopped now.
okay. Ooh,
Yeah.
is it police arresting our neighbors or something? I don't know. Um, the um, but the so that's how I got my first job. It was because of Dave's recommendation, and that was on Oh Brother Where Art Thou, and
Oh, wow.
and that was the water shot, where George Clooney. So when they called me on the phone and they're explaining the job, and they're guys holding onto a casket, and I have no idea what they're talking about. And so first I had a technical interview with Sean Chapman and Sean Faden. And so they're trying to
Yep.
ask me, and because I had been working in commercials, the only thing that I put on my demo reel was finished work, because advertising agencies only want to see finished work. And all these like tests that I did, I never showed anybody, because wireframe tests. And so they called me up, and they kind of like my reel or whatever. And so they're trying to figure out how much I knew about Houdini. And I'm like, well, have you ever used pops before? And back then that was particle thing and just brand new. And I said, well, I don't have anything on my demo reel, but I described to them over the phone what I did as my experiment. So they hired me like based on what I explained to them I knew how to do. And then I realized that, that studios aren't buying your demo reel, they're buying your brain.
Right.
And then so I got hired for Oh Brother, and the scene was set up by Sean and David Prescott and Johnny Gibson and Klaus Henke to get all the layers. Klaus was compositing, right? And so to get the
Mm-hmm.
whole pipeline to work through. And I learned so much from working with Klaus, because he would explain to me about getting something rendered and putting it into the scene and making it blend in there. And then Sean was a great lead to have, Cunningham, and then Prescott was great to work for. You got that blend of like, it's like working with Dave is like 55% fear and 25% technology, and 25% winging it or whatever, But
Yeah.
I love that environment, and when I first got to Didi, I thought I've been doing 3D for longer than all of these guys, or most of
Right.
them. And I started doing 3D when I was 28. So I was
Right.
back in 1986. So I'm a late bloomer. And then,
Right.
but I thought, well, how can there be, how are these people so smart? But at Digital Domain, people are helping each other. And so
Right.
everybody gets better, and they all get better, and they get better. And it's the companies where they don't have that environment that don't do as well. But Didi was one of those companies where people were really trying to help each other get better, and then everybody got better. And then I got called back to work on the first X-Men movie. And
Mm-hmm.
then I went over to and Johnny recommended me to go for Castaway, or you know, I never listed Johnny's name on my reference, Johnny Gibson. But
Right.
somebody at Sony knew him and who worked on Oh Brother. And I was working with Johnny's water shader on Oh Brother, and that was a whole mystery to me because the scene was already set up, and I just had to do the timing of the water. So in the George Clooney, John Turturro, and the third guy were hanging onto this casket, and the water that's above their heads all 3D, and the water that's below, and I had to match the timing of it. And so
Right.
I'd render a couple of seconds. It was a 60-second shot. So I'd render a few seconds and make adjustments on the timing and stuff until it blended. And the way they had set it up, and Johnny's shader looked like if you hit the render button, you could put your hand in there and grab a fish. I mean, it was just beautiful. And I'm like, I'm looking at the Houdini scene. It's just a flat grid. How did they do
Right.
that? And
Yep.
looking underneath it to see if there's any like leaves under the water, but there's nothing. And then, but so when I got done with it, I didn't really know how to tell anybody what I did because I didn't understand Houdini well enough. And so, but I paid attention, and boy, I'm like taking notes all the time. And back in those days, uh, everybody was at dailies, modeling,
Yeah.
lighting, everybody. And I learned from all of that. And so during dailies, I'm like taking notes for the lighters in the modeling department and everything like that, because I know that, I might be able to do my job better based on what I learned from somebody else. And then one big problem I think for people starting the business now is they don't have that background. And uh, like I've worked with other effects people. They're like afraid to go talk to the compositors, like they're going to get slapped or something. And I
Right.
remember like when I started at DD, Prescott would be like, the compositor is your best friend, and
Yep.
and more than once going to save my life, you know, and help me. And so and then when lighting got separated out, where there's a lighting department, that triangle of people, you have to be really tight with those people, and that what makes it a success. But then as movies grew, and the dailies got separated, now even um, the effects are in rotation. And so not even everybody in the effects department is at dailies at the same time. You like go
Sure.
in, go out, and I think especially the younger people, they just lose so much of not not having that benefit that we had when things were starting. So
Yeah. It was slower back then. We had a little bit more time than they have now, though.
yeah, yeah. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, everything is just grown. I mean, when I first came back to the U.S. from Singapore in '97, and the internet was just starting, but still back then, buying a home computer was still really expensive. And and I think two things drove the price of the computers down. It was like email. Everybody was like, "What's your email address?" And so people
Right.
had to have a computer to answer that question. And then the other thing is games and game cards. So like I upgraded at my Indie. At first I had an 8-bit card on it. So if I wanted to see full color, I had to transfer the image over to my Mac to see what it really looked like. And then I wouldn't
Right.
really see what it looked like until I output on video. And I worked with my Indie. I think I paid 20 grand for my Indie, but it was just an 8-bit card and
It's amazing.
not full color. Um, and so it was hard I didn't realize that hardware prices were going to drop like that. And then
Yeah.
the first license I bought of Houdini, I think I paid 20. They gave me a $3,000 discount. I paid $21,000 for it.
Well, Maya was 50 grand. Maya 1 was
Yeah,
50 grand.
right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
And
And
those
then,
SGIs were so expensive and it was ridiculous. After a while, I
yeah,
mean, because like NVIDIA, when the first NVIDIA cards, could do OpenGL, which was the whole deal of the SGIs. And those first NVIDIA cards, like the Riva cards, they cost like $300.
Right.
It was crazy.
And yeah, that was because I really liked the way the SGI system worked, and it was really sad to see that go. But
It was too expensive.
I wasn't sad about the price.
Yeah. I mean, think about it back then, right? When you were hiring someone to sit at a desk, you need to get an SGI, you need to get Maya, and you need to hire the artist. It was basically $250,000 per artist per seat,
right.
Yeah. And it's just so expensive. Yeah.
And you would only have one software on that computer because you can't afford to, have a license of something else on there. If you want to recover your profit, you just have to use that for that. So, and now on my Mac, I've got all kinds of stuff on it.
Right.
So it's a different world now. And
I remember when we first met. It was actually on Day After Tomorrow. That's when we first working together.
Right.
I guess you'd been at DD for a while, right?
Yeah.
And you were still into music quite a bit. Are you still into music quite a bit?
I damaged my left wrist really bad in 2017, and it's just starting to come back. And I found I could still play left-hand piano a little bit because I don't have to bend the wrists. And turns out playing the piano is good therapy for guitar playing. So I sold all my guitars, but I just bought a Telecaster like a couple of weeks ago. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna give it a stab. And I feel like a beginner, so my brain knows how to move my fingers. My fingers just don't know how to move my fingers. But I thought it's just physical. It's just exercise. And so if I stick with it, I might be able to play guitar again. But I can still play piano, which is I'm not as good at, but I have more fun. So.
Right. You had a banjo too. I remember you brought a banjo into work at one point.
Yeah. When I moved to Canada, I went to see a doctor. I got arthritis, and I got a football injury, and I got real bad arthritis where my legs all patched up. And a doctor prescribed me a medicine, and I lost 60% of my hearing. And I lost all the high tones. Like on the piano, if you click the top keys on the piano, I just hear the clunk clunk. I don't hear the note. And so it's like you turn the tone all the way down. And so my banjo sounded horrible. So I'm like, okay, I love the banjo. I love the way it sounded before. And it just made me mad that you give somebody medicine for short-term pain relief and it destroys the rest of your body.
Your hearing.
That's not right.
It's not right.
But I had one jazz guitar that always sounded really dark and deep. And that guitar still sounded the same. So I kept that one. I'm like, I could still play this one. It sounds the same. It's kind of dark sounding, but it sounded the same at least. But that was kind of a frustrating. So, and then my wrist, and I'm like, okay, maybe I'm supposed to stop playing guitar for a while or stop playing music because I not only lost my hearing, but my wrist. But,
yeah. But we were at for a while together. So how long were you at Digital Domain for?
I was kind of a come and go guy. So I was there for Oh Brother and X-Men, and then I went to Sony for Castaway and the first Harry Potter movie. And after the Harry Potter, I came back for 5 weeks to work on the Time Machine.
Oh, right.
that was interesting. And so like David, so this is my third show to work for Prescott. And then, so he says, come back to work for Time Machine. We got this thing. And then, were you there then yet?
I wasn't in Time Machine. I was right after that.
Okay. And then, so I didn't know what I was going to do. So my first day of work, I showed up and then, David said, we need to, and it had to do with the World Trade Towers being blown up. They were doing a shot that I think had a World Trade Tower in it disintegrating. And then when it got hit by the plane, they had to change the story. So they had a different New York shot. So they were kind of behind schedule. And so there's a camera shot that pulls from a close up in New York and goes all the way to the far side of the moon.
Right.
And part of it, so there's some clouds like over New York City, and that's like Alan Kepler's terrain. But when the clouds became global all the way around the Earth, they needed somebody to make the clouds move around the Earth, and then so David said, we've been working on the shot, and the first two guys who worked on it failed. We only got 5 weeks left. Good luck. And I had never done anything with clouds
Help
before.
us, Garman. You're our only hope.
Yeah, I guess so. Or scapegoat. We can kill him afterwards, and because he is not here full time, it's not going to hurt. And then anyway, so
Right.
David walked out, and then Lisa Spence walked in, and she said, you've been pre-approved to work 17 hours a day. If you need to work any more, just let me know, and I'll approve it. But up to 17 hours, you can work, no problem.
17 hours.
Yeah, and they gave me my own machine, which David said was the fastest machine at DD. So they put that next to me on the floor, and then I'm working on it. And so then I said to David, I went into pure panic mode, and I went to Amazon and I bought $400 worth of weather books. I'm like, I don't have time to check it out. Bing, bing, bing. I bought all these weather books. And so I asked David, can I spend 4 hours, 4 out of 17, that's not too many, but can I spend 4 hours every morning just studying weather so that if you come into my place, I'm not going to be on my computer, I'm going to be reading just for the first week.
Right.
Can I do that? And so he pre-approved that. And then I thought, like, $400 worth of books, the first Saturday is going to pay for that. And so I'll just chalk it up to business expense. So I got these books, and then one was like a fluid dynamics of weather. It's like after God created weather, he like took notes and wrote it down, and all this. And I didn't even know what the math symbols were, but it had these diagrams in there and these great explanations about what was going on. And so the math didn't really do me any good. And I'm guessing as I go. And so I thought of like 4 solutions. How do I solve this problem? And I thought, I don't have time to work on one solution and get it all the way through. And so I began to work a little bit on each one. And then, after a few hours of one of them, I'm like, this one's not going to work. And then I found out, like I emailed a guy at NASA, NOAA, the weather service.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, can you direct me to weather? Because back then there was some information on the web about weather, but it wasn't easy to find. So I emailed these NOAA scientists, and they emailed me back and says, here, look at this link here, look at this link here. And so back then they kept pictures of like a satellite would go around the Earth, and you'd get like every 16 hours, you'd get like a complete picture of the Earth. And it was all patchy. And I thought, well, maybe I could make a texture map thing of it moving around the Earth. So one of the stipulations that David said was that clouds have to be, it's the global clouds moving around the Earth, the big weather systems. And they need to be able to say, make it faster, make it slower. So it has to have those 2 constraints to it. And so I looked at all these weather pictures, but they only kept like a day's worth of the weather pictures online because I guess storage was expensive or something. I don't know. But so then I asked for if they would give me an old SGI. So they gave me an older SGI, and I wrote a script to it that would download all the pictures. So when NASA would delete them, I would still have them saved. And then I built my own like cloud going around the Earth thing from those pictures. And then I thought, well, there's going to be like so much retouching to do that. It would be a nightmare. And then, changing the speed on it would become almost in the time allowed impossible. And then I found out you could find a vector field of the wind motion at different levels. So they have a library of all that scientific information. And I thought, I could, I could write a thing that it did vector fields that push clouds around. And like for one thing, I'm not smart enough how to do that. So I don't know how to do that. And if I figured it out, it'd take me a little bit more than like probably 4 months than 4 weeks to figure out how to do it.
Right.
And so the technology is, or the data is there, but I can't use that. So then, but I read all this stuff about how weather moves, and I got all this stuff from NASA about stuff, um, and I thought, well, I'll just wing it, and I just animated it by eye. But I animated it all based on all that things that I was learning, and then Alan Kapler showed me a cool feedback loop that you can make in Houdini. So like you do a real simple particle thing, but then it would use
Okay.
the other image and do a little noise on it. And so you get all these cool little wispy things on it. And a real simple particle compositing trick that just looked beautiful. And so Alan showed me how to do that. And then I wanted something to do some distortion and circular distortion. And then so Johnny Gibson wrote a little tool for me for that. And in typical Johnny way, he said, "Stat of the fourth quadrant." Like, what does that even mean? But but there, just don't let anything go in the southeast corner of your vector field. But anyway, he wrote that little loop for me, so I made this clouds move,
Yeah.
and so it was really like art and science. So like I had to use the art part of my brain to make it look nice, but I used all the scientific stuff that I was getting, and so I had to guess because the shot is like 99 years in 90 seconds. And so
Right.
the Earth would look like a cotton ball. And so many of the time machine shots, people would say like, well, if it really worked that fast, it wouldn't look like, and right over the previous station, somebody put a sign that said, "Stop thinking." Because if you're trying to make something look like time lapse, it would not really look like that. So,
Right.
so just stop thinking about what it would really look like and just try to make it look pretty. So, and anyway, so I got my system worked out so that I got the timing right. And the first time I showed it to the director, he approved it. So then I did like one over the Pacific, North Pacific and South Pacific, and they approved that. And then I just did all the rest. And then around the center, the equator, are the doldrums of the clouds. And so I was giving these elements to Klaus, and then Klaus was like, "Oh, I got all these Titanic elements." And so he took these black and white pictures they shot of water for Titanic. And so I got to art direct him on, okay, around here we need these kind of small clouds. So he put all these like little clouds there, and this is like over Arabia, the clouds move in a certain way. Do that, put that there. And so between me and Klaus, we got the global clouds around the Earth now, and we just did it as a flat picture, and then I texture mapped it around a sphere, and
Awesome.
I got done a week early.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and it was like total panic, and I don't think I ever put in a 17-hour day because I was already over 40 by then, and I had worked too many 16-hour days for weeks on end doing commercials that my health isn't really great, and I think it's all that excessive overtime that added up
Yeah.
to that. So um, I don't
Yeah.
I don't really think that anybody should work any more than a 10-hour day ever.
That'd be nice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then, but I did notice, like, because when I was running my own company, I had to keep track of people's time and to keep track of my own time. I noticed the efficiency of younger people. I thought you can have an older guy work overtime and it's going to be worth it because they want to get home. But younger
Right.
guys will kind of, they're learning how to go from being in a university to being an employee. And I noticed that if guys were working more than a 10-hour day, if they worked a 12-hour days, they would screw around 2 hours in a day.
Right.
And I think, well, it's normal. It's maybe it's natural, but it's not that much more efficient. But the older guys, they're like there the whole 12 hours, because they've learned how to do that. So that's part of my view. And it's just like for me, on one of the big projects I was doing for Thailand of the property commercials I was working on, a couple of years after the first one, I did a big shopping mall, which is another big 60-second commercial. And I hired a company in London to help me with it. And they refused to kind of follow the blueprints. And then I had to fire them. And I lost $80,000 of my own money by doing that.
Oof.
Good lesson. But the first 50%, I paid them that. So, but I had to finish the whole commercial myself. And I noticed that after I worked so many hours, if I work too many hours, the next day I come in, I'm extra tired and I can't concentrate. So like at 7:00, I'm like, no matter how I feel, I'm going to go home, because if I go home now and I come back the next day, I'm going to be more productive. But if I stay late, I come back the next day, I'm going to be groggy. So anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I imagine. But you at some point, I mean, it wasn't that you got back to Texas for a while. Didn't you go to Texas for a while?
Yeah. So after I was trying to, I liked working in LA, and I liked the people I worked with. I love the people I worked with, but I didn't really like living in Southern California. I didn't want to grow
Right.
old there. Excuse me a second. And
Yeah.
I was already starting to grow old, and
Right.
and so after Stealth, I worked at Side Effects, and
Okay.
for a year in Santa Monica, and then I made while I was just starting Side Effects, or right before I started Side Effects, I made the Gnomon DVD, which I think was the first Houdini training DVD.
Yeah. Was it with Eric Hansen?
Yeah, that was
Yeah. Because I did the
Eric.
V-Ray one. That was the first
Yeah.
V-Ray one I did.
Yeah, and that was pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a couple of years later, I went to Beijing, and people would show me the Chinese version of my video, and I said,
ripped off
they were like,
version.
"Garman, we learned from you," and I'm like, "Okay, pay me the $3 my share of the royalties for that, please, will you?"
Yeah.
But and then so then DNA opened up in Dallas, and I'm still like, maybe now, but so that was in 2006, and I've been roaming the earth like ever since I graduated from my undergraduate degree. I haven't lived in any place more than 3 years. So the last
Right.
place I lived, in Ames, I was there for almost 4 years, and that's the longest I've lived in any place since I was a undergrad, or since I left home when I was 18. So,
Hmm.
and so then DNA was opening up in Dallas, and they were going to start, or they went from Jimmy Neutron, and they did the Ant Bully movie, and they hired a
Right.
bunch of LA people, and I'm just guessing about why they closed, but they probably just grew too fast. And they didn't have their next show lined up, or their financing for their next show lined up. And I'm sure it's complicated. And so after Ant Bully finished, they let everybody go. And I know the owners and the managers were heartbroken to do that. And so, but they, so I was in Dallas, and then I talked to Tom Linehan at UTD, and Tom Linehan worked with Charles Surrey, and Tom Linehan was Charles Surrey's second PhD student back in the early '60s for computer graphics, back at
Okay.
Ohio State, way back when. And so Tom Linehan was running this program at UTD, and he started the program in College Station, Texas. What's that? Texas
Yep.
A&M, the computer
A&M.
graphics. Yeah. And he
Yep.
started the place in Florida, Ringling. Yeah, I think,
Was it Ringling?
or
Okay. Or
maybe not
Full
Ringling,
Sail?
but not Full Sail. I think it was Ringling. I think he
Okay.
helped start that. And And so, and Tom was great. He's like the great motivational guy. Let's go. Let's be excited. And so he hired me to, I mean, he talked me into working on my PhD. And
Okay.
so I started a PhD program at UTD, and um, and then at the same time I started Viziaki, which was my online school. And I think I started Viziaki just a bit too early because what I had to pay to get it started. So like that now, online teaching is really easy to do, but back then there was a lot of investment, and so I never really came out ahead on Viziaki. And but I was working on my PhD, and I love that, and I was teaching, and that covered my health insurance and my rent, and and uh, and that's where I met Eddie Smith, Paul Carmen, and Carl Coleman. Was at
Oh, right.
UTD, and I think
Yeah.
you know all. I think you know those three guys,
Eddie was just on.
yeah. I listened
Yeah.
to that after I talked to you, and then another one was Robbie Thomas, who went to DD, and great, and they attracted really good students, and I really like that, and I like the other faculty. That was a great experience. I worked my direct boss was Midori Kitagawa, who's one of Tom's PhD students back at Ohio State. She's kind of a pioneer of computer graphics herself, and so I love that, but I was kind of running out of money, and then uh, Rhythm and Hughes and also Sony called me to come back. So I went back to work at Rhythm and Hughes. I went back out to work on Mummy 3 or the one set in China. I forget. Um, but
The Tomb of the Dragon and the Emperor or whatever.
yeah, Dragon Emperor. And then so I went back to there, and then I made it a deal with Tom. I was still teaching. I said, okay, 1 week I'll teach the class through the internet. So the students will come into the classroom and I'll be on the screen. If you can just get one student to coordinate it, we can do it. I don't know if we use Skype or what we use for that. And then I'll fly back the other week. So the other week I'll be there in person. And that was on my own dime to do that. And so I taught that last semester during that. And then another time I went back to work on uh, Beowulf at Sony. And then
Okay.
if Beowulf is a real guy, I would actually be related to him. If he was really a former king of Denmark.
From your Norwegian roots?
Yeah, well, my mom's Danish, and so it's through the Danish side. And then
Right.
her great grandfather, something like, was the king of Denmark. The queen was not the mother. So there was some family intrigue there. And so I grew a beard, and I said, well, if I'm gonna be related to Beowulf, I'll look like Beowulf for the movie. But and that was interesting working with. They had this, I think it was called Splat, Sony's volumetric tool, and then
Okay.
I got to work on 2 of Bob Zemeckis's longest shots. So he likes putting long shots in the movie, and on Castaway, once Tom Hanks, is into the life raft, there's a shot where it's just drifting. I think it was a 30-second shot, and Zemeckis wanted it to go completely black. And so the original screening, I think he wanted 3 minutes of just ocean sounds and wind blowing and total black. And it didn't sail very well in the screening, I guess.
Right.
But I worked on that shot. And then on Beowulf, there's a shot at the early part of the movie where it goes from a close-up of their drunken dining room table out through the roof, across a big valley into the monster's lair. And that was the other Zemeckis long shot. He likes having long shots in the movie. And there was the fog in that, and Sony had the Splat program. And that was the first time I ever worked with the, what's the big volumetric 3D matte render called? It's like a holdout. You, shame on me. Cut this out of the video.
Okay.
But where you could render full volume and then cut it out with the mask and compositing Z depth
Deep
Yeah.
pixels.
Deep. Yeah. So that was the first time I ever used the deep stuff, and then and I was working with Theo on that. And interesting, like one time we're in dailies, um, and I in my notes for my shot, I wrote my notes kind of like in old. I do a lot of shell programming, and so I wrote it like in shell programming code. And Theo was like, "Somebody here knows how to shell program." And so he gave me another shot to work on. Where there's a scene with like the giant battle scene in Beowulf probably has like 50 characters in it. I mean, it wasn't like, it was probably more like how wars were really back then. It wasn't like Lord of the Rings, 50,000 orcs. It was like 40 guys
Right.
fighting it out over Norway. And but he wanted to be able to see each character labeled in the shot. So I used Houdini. I wrote my own scripts to label all the characters so you can see the character and you can see the name of the character above his head. So and then I'm glad that I can use that old school programming type of stuff to do stuff. So like when
Right.
I have both Windows and a Mac, and on my Mac I use my Mac like it's a Linux station. Like I do everything through the shell and I write my own scripts, and but then I can still
Nice.
use Photoshop and because it's a Mac, right? So.
Right. That's cool. That's cool. But you're still teaching, right?
Yeah, I'm teaching now through the part time through the Vancouver Animation School,
Okay.
and I love teaching, and then part of my whole I think my reason for existence is to teach is that when I got my graphic design degree and I got a master's degree in drawing and painting, and then I wanted to teach, and I found out that an MA and an MFA in the eyes of academia are two different things. So MA is kind of a pat on your back of like, oh, you want to stay around a little bit more and take another class. Good for you. Whereas at
Right.
MFA, you have to really kind of develop something of your own. And these are all different at different universities. But I got my MA, and I think and that's what I did the computer programming thing. I think I really did MFA work when I got it. I did enough to do that, but uh, looking back, and so teaching was always kind of awkward for me because if a university wanted to hire me, I was like qualified experience wise, but I wasn't qualified academically.
Right.
And but I taught at Savannah College of Art and Design and threw a bunch of great students out into the industry. I'm sure you've run across some of them
Yep.
here and there. One of them is Renee Tam. She's now the global head of technology for rendering at Pixar for a show.
Yep.
And so big shot there. Really smart person. And Alex Lim, who worked on a lot of movies, and then he's working on Aurora now on using Houdini for training AI for automated vehicles. So another
Right.
use of what we do. And Jamie Miguel and forgive me for all the people I mentioned, but anyway, a lot of great students. Mir Ali, Jason Mayer, came out of my time at Savannah, and when I was working. So when I was early in my program, I tried to apply for teaching jobs, and the schools would say, "We need somebody with more experience," and you're just like out of school, and and so I thought, "Oh, I'm going to go get some work experience," and so and then when I think it was already like year 13, and I was working on um, Harry Potter, and then I met
Right.
Steve Levites at Sony, and he had come from SCAD as a student from SCAD, and if you know Levites, he's like more smart than should be legally allowed, and uh, and so I was like, wow, SCAD teaching. And then Steve was kind of like, why do you ever want to go back and teach, man? This is like the greatest place to be in production. And I'm like, but I made a promise, I'm going to get work experience so I can teach. And so I kind of felt like obligated to do
Right.
that. So I applied and I took like I think I 75% cut and pay or something to go to SCAD, but
Right.
but I felt like I had to do it, and I'm glad I did for all the students that I met. And but then after I was there for a couple of years, Dee Dee was like, Garman. So it's the first time, that Garman, come back. How much do you want? And I'm like, they've never been like that with me before.
Right.
And so I went back to work on The Day After Tomorrow, which was a rough show. Like
Oh yeah.
within Dee Dee, it was okay, but there were forces there that made it a
Yep.
difficult, difficult show. A lot of good stories in hindsight.
Yeah.
And but I worked on, like, there's one shot looking at a water buoy from underneath the water, up at a silhouette, and it's just quick shot. And David had estimated, like, I'd work on it for 3 weeks, and I worked on it for like 3 months, and
I remember that
it
shot.
kept getting
But that was
changed,
just
added.
it was just that someone couldn't make a choice about anything at that time. It was ridiculous.
I know. So, like, I did this chain, and they're like, "Well, we want rust on the chain." So I put rust on it. Well, we want little barnacles. Okay, I put barnacles on it. Or we want these little, like, guys to stick out. And the beginning of the shot is looking down, and you know who we're talking about.
Yeah.
Like, we want. So I got a reference of California kelp that was backlit by sunlight. So looking down in the water on the North Atlantic Ocean on a cloudy day, she wanted to see backlit kelp glowing. And I'm like,
Looking down.
looking down, yeah, looking down on a cloudy day. And so I put all this stuff in there, and it just ended up looking muddy. And then when the director first shot, he said, I just wanted a silhouette, and all that stuff that I did disappeared. I could have been done in 3 weeks,
Right.
but the whole show was kind of like that. And then that
Yep.
was,
We were doing turntables of hailstones to make sure we had approval of the hailstone shapes.
yeah,
We're
it was,
motion blurred.
but the work we did, and even the work that we did that never made it into the movie because it was redone, was as good as the stuff that made it into the movie. It's just, so, but anyway, it was I was kind of protected from that. There was one moment where Prescott was worried I was going to hit somebody when they said something to me, but he was actually worried I was going to, like, haul off and slug her. And but they really did a good job of protecting the artists from that. But the supervisors took the hit.
They did.
Yeah, and then and The Day After Tomorrow, that was like a completely different show where it was so well run. And then the client, Rob Cohen, always came in, made a decision.
Oh, stealth, I mean.
Yeah,
Stealth.
stealth. Oh, yeah, what did I say? Yeah, stealth. Yeah, stealth. And then that was just like the polar opposite of working on a movie. And I mean, it was so well run, and it was so good. Like, afterwards, like, that's the greatest movie I've ever worked on. I never want to do that again. Because they ended up on Stealth or Day After Tomorrow. They hired a lot of younger artists who a lot of them went on to do really good work, but they were straight out of school and they didn't really know how to work. And they could do the work, but they were like, like, you walk into, people say, I got to do my homework tonight, and somebody says pizza, and they all run out having a pizza. And
Right.
new hires kind of tend to be like, they haven't learned how to discipline themselves from being a university student or student to an employee. And their first show really, teaches them how to do that. And so they hired, the people went on to be great people, but they had to learn how to do that. So that was the frustrating thing of Day After Tomorrow. But then the Stealth was like, okay, Dee Dee was like, well, we're not going to do that again. We're not going to hire all these new hires. But a lot of them got rolled over onto the show. But it was really a crack team of people, and everybody did their job, and it was it was fantastic. And yeah, so like from a production management point of show, Stealth was definitely my most favorite movie I worked on. And then I got to be
Interesting.
a lead, which was cool, and had a great crew underneath me, which was did all the hard work. And so then I had the luxury of assigning myself shots. Like, oh, I want to do
Yep.
that one. I'll do that one. uh,
Yep.
and then I worked with Lou Pecora and Jamie. Oh, I forget
Hmm.
Jamie's last name, the coordinator. And so the
Yeah.
powerhouse group of people I was working with on that show, fantastic. So, uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's when I
That's
really
awesome.
began to talk to you. I think the first time was Stealth.
Well, we were talking on, I remember, I was, Day After Tomorrow was my first movie. So I was curious about everything. So I would hang out with you, or see, Blakey, or I would, what was going on with Rocco. Remember
Right.
Rocco?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And so,
yeah,
that's, obviously that's when Martini Night started and all of that kind of stuff. But I was always in Prescott. I would ask him a bunch of questions, or Sean Faden, and all those
yeah,
guys. Yeah. So I got very curious, and I just asked people all kinds of questions, because that, you were right. That was the thing about that place, is that it was a place that allowed you to sort of hang out with people and learn what they're doing.
right.
I sat down with Brian Grill, right? Brian Grill taught me, like, what's the art of compositing? How do you take all this stuff and make it all look perfect?
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah.
And those guys were like that, like one time I had problems with a shot and by compositing shot, and they had a junior compositor working on it. I think, and I complained about it, or let people know. And then one day Brian came over, gives me a hug, sits down on my machine, and kind of like fixes it.
Right.
And that's what Dee was like. And uh, yeah, it was a
Yeah.
I'm
I just had sort of I recorded my 100th episode of Martini Giant, and I had Scott Ross on as a
oh yeah,
guest. So
yeah.
yeah, we were talking about the old Day After Tomorrow times.
I
So
was sitting inside at my desk when the book burning happened.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
But that
yeah.
was a yeah, that was a amazing environment.
Hmm.
And because of my interest in music, like there was a documentary called The Wrecking Crew.
Hmm.
I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's about the studio musicians of the 1960s, the early 60s, who they recorded, they did a lot of the early hits, and so maybe there were other musicians listed on the album, part of the band, like Mr. Tambourine Man. McGuire, I think, is the only guy that actually played guitar, but it was all professional musicians who played for Mr. Tambourine Man for the Byrds. Um,
Right.
and it's all these studio pros who did all did the tracks. And so that's an interesting documentary. Like, I like it because of music, but also there's kind of parallels between the studio music scene and also the visual effects, the way that that's kind of gone. And um, it used to be that all the musicians were in one room together and they all learned from everybody and they'd work out the songs together. And then now everybody kind of records their track in their own little home studio, and you don't have that camaraderie. And I think that's probably part of the reason why pop music sounds the way it does today, is that um, you don't have musicians like rising to that level that they can do together. And then,
Right.
um,
Right. I
and
hear
I
you.
and I, I'm sure that, like, working on a movie remote, like I worked on Black Adam a little bit a few months ago,
Oh,
and
okay.
I did that remotely, and um, I didn't like the remote aspect, because if you have somebody a question and you can't get an answer, or something like that, and you could just walk over to somebody and get a quick look or something. And the working remote thing is, I liked it because I could work at home. The other thing is I could be in Iowa, but that was the logistics was nice, but I didn't like the practicality of working remotely
Got
on a
it.
show. So.
I can
But
see that.
I always liked teaching, and then so my goal is like I wanted to work in production so that I could become a better teacher. And sometimes I think, the only way to really learn how to use our tools is in a production setting with a bunch of other people. Um, and so like especially like the way Houdini keeps knocking out all these like amazing tools is that I really have to learn from somebody else, and they're new and people are trying it, and so that's kind of why I've always like jumped back into production. Sometimes it's because of money, but uh, when the technology changes, if I want to be a better teacher, I need to see how it's used in production. So that's part of the reason why like I've gone back and forth. Um,
Right. Right.
you know.
Well, we're kind of getting a little long on time. I just want to make sure we have an opportunity to talk about some of the cool stuff that you're doing recently. So, what's going on more recently with you besides working on Black Adam remotely?
Yeah, so Black Adam was just a couple months and
Yeah,
some trailer shots, and then but I got I went back to school finally and got my MFA. I didn't get a PhD, and
nice.
I my mother like she had worked in fashion in New York and Paris and came to Iowa and married my dad. How, like how did that happen? She's
Right,
Danish, and so in my career, my mom was like, "Go explore the world." I mean, I'm like from a little farm town of like 1,400 people. I think there was
right,
800 people here when I graduated from high school. But my mom was always like, "Go explore. Just be sure to write me a letter
right.
um, once in a while and tell me how it's going." And so when I lived in Asia, I brought my mom over to see me a couple of times. She liked that. Um, but I've always like tried to return to the teaching thing. So I'm teaching part time now for Vancouver Animation School, and I'm always on the lookout for more teaching opportunities. But now I need my mom's 98, and I returned to Iowa to be closer to my mom, and so I'm here for now, and I'm not going to move anywhere for the time being. And
Right.
so and so I just need to be able to carry on, and then I'm at retirement age, but I don't think I'll ever really officially retire.
I don't
And
think so.
no, and but and so I got my MFA just in time to turn 64, I think. And but what I did is my mom always wanted me to talk about stories about what I did. And I think I've traveled to 23 countries and I've worked in 17, and um, uh, work or visited a client or something like that is counts as work. But mostly in Asia uh, and so, so I told my mom these stories, and she always wanted me to write my stories down. So my big project has been to write my stories down, and then also some people hassled me about it, but I always kept notebooks. I don't know if you ever saw me, but I held a notebook I always carried around, and the big reason why was that if I had a notebook, like somebody in Bangkok once walked off with my notes I had for my client. Like I had this messy, scribbly piece of paper with my notes on it. Somebody answered the phone call, grabbed my scribbly piece of paper, wrote something down, and walked out the door with it. And that was my notes for my client I was working on.
Oh my
And I
God.
tried chasing the guy down the hallway, but he was like in a taxi and gone before I could get to him. And I thought, well, I need
Wow.
to keep a book that nobody will walk off. And then when I got to DD, there was all these words that I was learning that in dailies, I was like, I don't know what they're saying or I don't know what they're talking about. And so I would write that down and then look it up later. And uh, and then people, because you work on a big show, somebody will say, go see Bob, and you'll become friends with Bob for like 15 minutes and you'll never talk to him again for 6 months. Um,
Right.
and so my book is like who's who of who I'm working on. And
Right.
and so I had my notebooks, and then I got picked on a little bit for my notebooks. But now I have the secret formula of how I built the brooms for the first Harry Potter movie, and how I animated the ripple effect for the time machine, and all that stuff's in my notebooks. And so,
Awesome.
and then so Prescott a few months ago, he said, "You got to publish your notebooks." And so I'm trying to work on that of because there's a story behind every page, and so I'm trying to like write some stories to go along with that. And so that's the
That's
kind of thing
awesome.
my mom wanted me to do. And so when I was living in Bellingham, Washington, and I finished working for MPC, and I was trying to start my own little studio, and I thought, well, I'll go back to do light commercial work like I used to do back in the early days. But then I like, well, my modeling skills are not very good. My rendering skills are not very good because I hadn't been doing it for so long. And then I thought, if I'm going to have my own little studio, I need to learn how to do 3D tracking because so much is over the background. And so I learned how to do that. And then while I was in Bellingham, my sister was like, bugging me to come back to Iowa, be around your mom. Be around your mom. You haven't been around her for 30 years. Shame on you. And then, and then one of the professors at Iowa State, who he wasn't, I'm much older than him, but I'd become friends with him over the years, and he had invited me back to talk to his class. Like here's the alumni that that went off and did whatever. And he's like, well, why don't you come back and think about becoming a student again? Because I think I had talked to him about my desire to get my PhD and not getting it. And so I came back to Iowa State, and I thought, well, for my project, I can work on writing my book or writing my story, and with adult supervision. So,
Right.
um, and then having doing that as my master's degree project. Uh, so I ended up writing. I got 35 years worth of stories about work, and I thought, well, that could make a great novel that never ends. um, and then because I worked in movies before, I thought, well, if I write it in the form of a screenplay, that's going to be 60 minutes or 120 minutes, and you have to stop. And if you're going to tell a story, you have to chop stuff out of it. And so I picked. Like it's about a 2 year period of when I was living in Hong Kong and I was working in Beijing at the Weather Service and also going to Thailand. So I kind of condensed like 3 or 4 years down into 6 months in the story. And then so the idea was to write it and then do some storyboards of a couple of the scenes. And so that's what I was going to do. And then I got carried away and I did all this production design and production planning. And it's hanging off my website. It's called 52 and a half feet.
Yeah.
And so I wrote that story. And the 52 and a half feet comes from a real number in 1992. If you communicated with your client overseas, the fastest communication was a fax machine, which is black and white and pretty crappy looking. But great technology at the time. And then the next best solution was you would FedEx or DHL a videotape. And then the third best solution is you hop on an airplane and you go see the client. And I was living in Hong Kong, but my clients were in Taiwan or Hong Kong, mostly, or Thailand. And so one year I was on an airplane every 4 days and flying to a different country. And because I was working these crazy hours, sometimes the only time I got a good night's sleep was on the airplane and in the hotel after the meeting with the client. And then I'd hop on the plane and come back to Hong Kong. And I was doing the production work in Hong Kong, but my clients were in Thailand. And that year I was averaging how much I was flying. And my average height off the ground, like if you spend so many hours at 36,000 feet and so many hours at sea level, where like Hong Kong and Bangkok are basically at sea level, my average height off the ground was 52 and a half feet for 1 year. So that's where the title comes from, is that. And so I incorporate, and so like when I'm writing a story, I had to put some visual effects in my story. So I have like a pseudo plane crash that plane getting so low it crashes into the water. That was my effect that I wrote into my story. So then I
That's crazy.
storyboarded all that stuff. So I made the storyboards. And then because of COVID, like for a master's degree, you're supposed to have a gallery show. You're supposed to rent out a gallery and put all your works in a gallery. And for COVID, they closed down the gallery at the university. So then I made a 3D gallery and I picture, so on my website for the show or the YouTube channel, there's a video walking through the gallery. So,
That's awesome.
and then I did all that work in Modo, which is a 3D program, and
Yeah.
uh, partly is that it can do things easily that Houdini can't do. And then also I had been paying for it since 2.0 and never really used it. I thought I need to get my money back out of this. So I used Modo and it worked out pretty good. And the thing I like about Modo is that Houdini's over here and Modo's over here. And so they kind of
Yep.
blend together nicely. So,
Yeah.
and so,
Cool.
so now I'm qualified to get a teach at a university because I have my MFA, but I'm here in Iowa for now and teaching remotely part time.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Garman, it's such an amazing story. You've done so many different things. So it was such a great opportunity. I was really excited to talk to you. It's like, I should talk to Garmin because you've come up, as you said, you've come up in conversations with a number of great artists that I've worked with as like, oh yeah, I was taught to do this by Garmin and Garmin. So you've been a mentor to a lot of great people and very talented people. So it's really great everything you've been doing for them, for sure.
Well, thank you. Yeah. It was all about teaching. So, but yeah.
That's great.
And then I'm so glad I learned how to teach because I worked with a lot of great people who taught, and a lot of the things in 3D were difficult for me to learn.
Right.
And having somebody help me, and I'm like, if I can pass that on. So
For sure.
anyway,
For sure.
thanks for having me on your show. I'm honored.
Well, no, thank you. This was great.